Welcome to the Asia Climate Finance Podcast, where we discuss climate action-related business, finance, and investment topics, including issues around clean, green, net zero emissions, and sustainable energy, as well as climate, environmental, green, and sustainable finance. Hello, and a warm welcome to the Asia Climate Finance Podcast. Today is episode 34, and we're going to talk about solar, specifically solar in China. Why? Well, the development of China's solar industry is key to the nation's as well as the world's net zero ambitions. Installed capacity in China was about 392 gigawatts in 2022 and is set to grow further over the next few years. In this episode, we speak to Frank Haugwitz, who has been involved in the sector for over 2 decades. He is a senior advisor and China representative of Apricum, a transaction advisory and strategy consulting company. We first briefly look at the history and background of the industry and identify the reasons behind the massive growth. We then look at the current state of the industry. And finally, we evaluate the future opportunities and challenges to the industry. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and please remember to listen to the disclaimer at the end of the podcast. Hi, and again, welcome to episode 34 of the Asia Climate Finance Podcast. As mentioned today, we have Frank Haugwitz. We're going to be talking about China solar. Hello, Frank. I understand that you've been traveling all over the place. You just got home, so I hope your jet lag is not too bad.
No, not at all, Joseph. Yeah, but yes, I just came back from Intersolar Europe, or what is now called the Smarter E-Europe. Just came back 2 days ago. Yeah, so no, all good at my end. Thank you.
Great. Well, glad you're well, and thank you so much for making the time today. And we're going to talk about, as I said, China solar. But before we talk about that, could you tell us a little bit about your background?
True. Well, actually, way back in the days, I undertook a 3.5 years apprenticeship in order to become an industrial mechanic. And after a couple of years in the industry, I thought I should further qualify myself. So I applied for higher education, and then after I met an entrepreneur who suggested I should look into China, I thought, yes, I can take that look. So I went to the university and learned international business administration, Chinese business language, East Asian economies. And during my study, I very much focused, next to a couple of my studying colleagues, on environmental protection and the energy sector. And once I submitted my diploma thesis, I learned about a job opportunity in China, pretty much 2 months after I submitted my thesis. And that was in June 2002, when I left for China with a 3-year contract in order to work as a so-called junior expert, to work in a German-supported technical cooperation project focusing on solar energy in rural areas. So basically, we advise the National Energy Administration on how to draft the renewable energy law, how to take into account the German experience with the so-called feed-in tariff support scheme. We provided trainings for rural technicians in order to ensure that so-called off-grid PV power plants will be operated and maintained in the long run. I've been doing this back then for 5-6 years. Then I moved into an EU program, EU-China Technical Cooperation Program, again focusing on renewable energies, slightly more focusing on offshore wind power or offshore wind power in total. And then was the time when I thought, should I stay or should I leave? And that was around 2009, 2010. And between, let's say, 2004, 25, 2005. So there wasn't hardly any of let's say, solar PV industry existing in China. But that changed by 2009, 2010. Yeah? I thought, I guess I should stay. You know? I guess it was the right decision. Yeah. So I founded then my own company, the Asia Europe Clean Energy Advisory Company, providing consulting services to clients who are either interested in upstream activities or downstream, or needed to know the regulatory framework, et cetera, et cetera. In parallel, I was working for Intersolar, starting from 2010 as the global head of conference development. And that brought me then to markets like the US, Brazil, India, Middle East, Europe, of course. And that helped me to put, let's say, China solar PV market development in a more global context. And for 1 year plus now, I'm working as a senior advisor and China representative for Apricum, which is a globally active transaction advisory and strategy consulting company headquartered in Berlin. Yes, so that is my brief background in a nutshell.
No, that's great. And most of it was in Beijing, I remember. You spent also
very true. Yeah, I was always given, because my first job was policy advisor to the government. Yeah, so we were based in Beijing. Yeah, and I stayed on in Beijing. Yeah, I simply felt comfortable over the years. Yeah, I mean, you get to know your way around. Yeah. Of course, you got to know colleagues working in the same field. And in the early days, the industry was pretty much, let's say, driven by politics made in Beijing, right. Not somewhere else in the provinces. Yeah, so that's why, yes, I'm one of them who has stayed on in Beijing for 20 years.
That's it's pretty amazing, and obviously we met numerous amount of times in Beijing, in Hong Kong, in Shanghai throughout the years, and I think we've probably known each other for a couple of decades. But let's not say that too loud; makes us both not so young. But going back to wrapping up your work with Apricum, and this is not a advertising spot for the company, but could you kind of explain a little bit more about what is the actual work that you do, and how much is it China, how much is the rest of Asia, etc.?
Well, no, it is not a marketing pitch, not at all. Yeah, I mean, given let's say China's global footprint in the solar PV industry, yeah, whatever happens on the ground, it has global implications. Yeah. So whether it's as always massive oversupply, or you have new entrants, because right now the industry is considered being fairly attractive as well for let's say solar PV related companies. So I'm tracking on what is happening, particularly in the upstream sector. So it means all along the value chain, whether it's the price development of polysilicon, wafer cells and modules, who is doing what, how good, how bad, who of these companies has global aspirations. Most of them have. Is there an opportunity for them to collaborate with international companies? Yes or no? Yeah, would there be something? Then as well, China has the last 5 years plus has become very innovative. Now you see a couple of innovations coming out of China, so they do set trends once in a while. Of course, as well, are there possibly investment opportunities? Because still a couple of companies are stock listed. Whether the investors are either based in US or in Hong Kong, and they would like to have a third-party perspective on how the market is ticking. So, and as well, supplier. As of recent, we had a couple of developments. So international buyers are now taking a closer look about supply chain issues, et cetera. So here we try to shed some light on how things are on the ground.
Got it. I think maybe in this conversation it'd be worth starting up talking about a little bit of the background. I mean, obviously, today with ChatGPT or whatever, you can very, very easily get the background of the solar industry in China, but I think getting it from you, because you were involved pretty much from day one. I mean, when the renewable energy law came out in the early 2000s, I mean, you were there, you participated in that. So I think it may be worth talking a little bit about, very, very briefly, about the history so that we can better understand what's going on now.
True. Well, I mean, the early 2000s, I mean, the main focus of the Chinese government was to provide or supply power to people living in off-grid areas. So back then they had this so-called the Brightness program. It was a multi-million-dollar program covering plus 1,000 townships with, if I'm not mistaken, between 2 or 3 million people, no access to modern electricity. And back then, 20 years ago, there was this massive domestic migration of laborers from the West moving over to the east side of China in the search for work, etc. So here it was the government's intention, to provide decent, let's say, conditions for living in such areas. And then along with this China Brightness program, then you had a couple of companies like Intersolar, Canadian Solar, Suntech, Yingli Solar. So all of them I know before they became so, let's say, big as they are today. Or before they got stock listed abroad, or nowadays as well back home again. And that was basically the kickoff of the upstream development. Most likely it was Suntech stock listing in December 2005 in New York, where a couple of companies followed them in order to raise capital for production capacity expansion. Mm-hmm. And that gained, and at the same time, possibly the most instrumental policy of all were two. There was the so-called strategic emerging industry policy. That means the central government in Beijing, they have identified in total 7 strategic emerging industries like telecommunication, high-end equipment manufacturing, chemicals, IT, environment protection, energy /renewables /solar PV. So they thought about, well, most likely these kind of 7 industries in the long run, in the long term, from a very strategic point of view, there will be a significant demand which helps China in order to meet global demand, but as well it helps China to for its own industrial upgrade. So no longer be the workshop of the world for, let's say, low-tech products. Today, PV is definitely high-tech. So yes, it is a commodity, but it has definitely contributed a lot to the industrial upgrading, because it's not only the PV module, the entire supply chain or ecosystem around it, which has evolved over the last 15 to 20 years. So that was one part, the strategic emerging industry policy, long-term, which still exists until today. Actually, it has accelerated the last, let's say, 18 to 24 months. That means in the past, such kind of industry policy was always being defined and decided by Beijing. Now, no more. You have provincial industrial policies dedicated to solar PV, like in Shanxi, like in Guangdong, like in Sichuan. You have these action plans, etc. So it becomes more. It has gotten a more provincial focus as of late. Why that? Because with the onset of the current 14th five-year plan in 2021, the renewable energy industry was being identified as the next growth engine, and hence local governmental officials are now keen to tap into that area, so to make use of it, to promote production in particular, not only deployment on the ground. So that is one aspect, the industry policies, which has been in place for 20 years and counting. And the other hand was, well, then you mentioned earlier, the Renewable Energy Law, which came into effect 2006. So that basically for the first time that the government has officially recognized the importance of renewables in the long run in its overall energy mix. And because between my time when I arrived in 2002 and 2004, we had 4 years of advice on how to advise the government on the drafting, providing input, drawing on German experience. But it was basically the kickoff for as well local deployment, with a couple of, let's say, pilot programs like the Go with the Sun program, for instance, which we had back in the days, or we had even some provincial feed-in tariff support schemes, like in Jiangsu, for instance, which was some kind of the early, one of the probably most early in offering such kind of support scheme. And that gave basically the privately owned industry. PV is pretty much a majority is privately owned, which is changing as of late. A couple of state-owned enterprises are too entering the solar PV industry in the upstream, not only downstream. So, but back then in 2006, with the 10th or 11th five-year plan, so with the Renewable Energy Law, that gave these privately owned enterprises the necessary confidence that the government means it and is in it in the long. Hence, they kept on investing in upstream and producing, meeting demand at home, but pretty much were export oriented at the time. So it's basically these two kind of policies: industry policies, long-term support on pretty much all levels, and with the Renewable Energy Law, that the government itself is now is being convinced that we're good for its own country in the long run.
But I think that's true for clean energy of any kind, solar, hydro, wind, any form of clean energy anywhere in the world. The first thing that has to appear is government support. Now, the government support can be very, very strong, or that government support can be relatively not as clear, but it's there. What I mean by not clear is that they don't necessarily haven't formulated very detailed policies or financial support schemes, but at least it's there. So investors know that in this particular jurisdiction, the government there is committed long-term to renewables. So people, that's a signal for going into investment. And because I think an interesting example is Australia, where for a decade you had government not really supportive of where they were basically climate change deniers and not very supportive of the industry. And the minute that the new federal government, about a little bit over a year ago, came in, all of a sudden the investors have got that signal, and so the investment came in quite quickly. Now, the interesting thing in China is, as you mentioned, is the policy support, but at the same time, it's really the industry players where you had companies like Suntech, which is now defunct, and others invested in the industry. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of the main players over the last 2 decades in China?
Well, I mean,
better understand the background.
Well, I mean, they all started like any other company from a small level. I mean, it was they were amongst the earliest companies who saw the opportunities, and they benefited to some extent as well from what I mentioned earlier with the brightness program. Yeah, so basically to meet the domestic demand for solar panels. But then the real demand actually emerged outside of China for solar panels. That was back then when in the year 2000, Germany introduced its own Renewable Energy Law, or the feed-in tariff support regulation, when then Germany at its peak times was basically responsible for 50% of the global demand. And Chinese companies were keen to meet this demand. Yeah. What has contributed to the rise of a couple, or emergence of a couple of Chinese PV companies, that a good number of them, they have graduated abroad. In particular, the New South Wales University in Australia, under the guise of under Professor Martin Green. So there's this famous picture which Martin Green shows on and off there, when he looks back, when he had a dozen or 1.5 dozen of Chinese colleagues studying in his laboratory, to point from above. And then amongst all these heads of these different Chinese colleagues, now you have seen they put the company logo, and they're all pretty famous now. Or most of them, Some disappeared or got smaller or got acquired, But the most dynamic in the early days was definitely Mr. Xu Jingrong, the founder and CEO of Suntech back in the days. So basically, the development of the PV industry I mean, let's say from a pure upstream perspective, was driven or nurtured by the demand on the ground with the brightest program, but as well in terms of that demand outside of China was booming, in particular in Germany, and there very much in Germany. I remember this discussion with these CEOs, when they talked about, I'm planning to set up a production facility, let's say with 1, maybe 2 megawatt. Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, back in the day, that was considered fairly large. Yeah? Today, the benchmark is slightly higher. So amongst Chinese companies, if you would like to enter the solar PV industry, anything below 10 gigawatts is considered an embarrassment. So it's too small to be seen, too small to be recognized. So rather make it 20. Yeah, I mean, play big. Yeah? I mean, and many companies, as of late, they do have such kind of ambitions. Of course, I mean, you had then what I mentioned earlier with the strategic emerging industries. Yeah? So along with that kind of policy, companies added production capacities. Yeah? And the last 10 years was just phenomenal. Yeah? A couple of these companies have gotten fairly large over the last 20 years, but as well thanks to hard work. I know a couple of them, they had hardly any weekend off. You know, they were on a 24/7 call. Yeah. So it's not that it was just everything coming along their way. You know, it was kind of a plain sailing. Not at all. Yeah. So they have given their, a big chunk of their life in order to make this happen. Yeah. So it's not that you simply could. The business will come anyway. Yeah, we just benefit from it. No. They put it hard work into it, as well, because as always, the PV industry is no exception, is subject to brutal competition, so that you are not allowed to rest on your laurels. Something like this does not exist in China. So a couple of these companies, like I mentioned before, like Canadian, like Trina, like Jinko, like Suntech, and et cetera, JA Solar, and so on and so forth. Yeah. This is a result of 20 plus years of hard work.
One final thing about the background that I think is worth clarifying is about the whole, financing bit, because I think there's a perception among some people that the whole Chinese solar industry basically was built by the Chinese government, sponsored, subsidized by the Chinese government, and that's about it. So that's why the solar industry got so big so quickly. Could you kind of explain a little bit of how the whole thing was financed?
Well, I mean, it's a combination like anywhere else. You have government support, then you raise capital. What I mentioned earlier with the stock listing of Suntech abroad, which set an example. So a couple of companies followed. So they raised significant funding outside of China because they couldn't get as much as they wanted back home. So then, of course, it is the Chinese nature to accept risks. Yeah, I'm sure that a couple of them, they had some sleepless nights, with what they have taken on board in terms of, let's say, financing and under what kind of conditions. So it's not definitely not true, that the whole thing was financed by the government. Definitely not. I mean, you have similar support schemes in other international markets too, where the government is offering, let's say, preferential, favorable conditions, because that means lower interest rates, etc., or the government has given away a piece of land at a reduced price, etc. So that is kind of where I think you will find it anywhere in the world as well, not only in China, but it's more that the risk appetite is more prominent amongst Chinese solar PV colleagues, I would say.
Right. So in essence, what we've talked about so far in terms of background is that you had an enormous amount of policy support starting from the early 2000s, and you had a whole bunch of really local startups that became very, very, very large, and most of them were pretty much independent private companies that raise money just like anybody else through equity capital raising, stock markets, bank financing, and the rest. So the reason why, and I'm going to put words in your mouth, the reason why the Chinese solar industry got so big so quick is really the government support, but also a bunch of very, very agile and aggressive small companies, which obviously now are gigantic, but small companies that build up the industry from scratch. That's really what we're talking about, right?
Definitely. And one more aspect, I mean, as I mentioned, a couple of them have graduated abroad, in this case, at the University of New South Wales. So they knew the technology by heart. So they were not just entrepreneurs. So they had a very sound understanding of the technology at hand, and what was required and needed in order to push it forward to the next level. And that combined with the entrepreneurial spirit, so to say. So that basically, yes, all what you've been saying, true, but as well, they knew what they were talking about. Right. So that kind of... and some companies from an early start, they try to have as well international collaborations. So that was always a kind of exchange to this very day. So that certainly helped too. And in the early days, China was very much dependent on import of manufacturing equipment. So they too spent a good amount of money on importing the equipment, allowing them to produce, panels equal to international peers.
Right. Moving on to the kind of current state of the industry, what is the current state of the solar industry in China as we speak, in terms of gigawatts that are being put out and stuff like that?
Well, as always, and we have been discussing this for years, massive overcapacity. It's a gigantic wave coming along. Right now, everyone is working in full gears. It's kind of amazing. Like what I mentioned with if you announce something as a company below 10 gigawatt, it's embarrassing. So no. Right now you have this kind of top 5, top 10 companies gain market share year by year. Such kind of companies are getting bigger year by year. If you're looking at polysilicon, Tongwei, Dachuan, two, or then, for instance, wafer TCL or Zhonghuan and Longi in particular, in the cell segment, down in the module segments, holy, it is kind of it's brutal. It's brutal competition, and it's motivated by or driven by innovation. Innovation tops everything. And innovation is being measured by whether company AECEA has again pushed the cell efficiency world records to another level, and that is kind of amazing. How, if I'm not mistaken, just last year they pushed the world record 7-8 times to the next level, something like that. That is, there's no resting. And as of late, because now the majority of manufacturing is N-type based. P-type is pretty much phasing out. Now it's dominated by TOPCon technology, and but heterojunction is just behind the corner. So not far off. Just 4 weeks ago when I was in Shanghai attending the SMEC exhibition, I was surprised how many, dozens of companies I haven't heard before are now a module player. And they have this two kind of strategies. The one is, all right, we bet on TOPCon right now. We want to cash in for the next 2-3 years. and then maybe we have to transition. Then we can finance the transition from TOPCon towards head-on junction. Or you have the other new players that say, no, TOPCon will soon be over. We focus right now on head-on junction, and then in 2 years we will be ahead of the other ones who will then be transitioning from TOPCon to head-on junction. And perovskite, you have at least 2 dozens of undertakings in the field of perovskite, which is another, let's say, very promising concept of solar cells. Still far out, much more far out compared to head-on junction. But this again gives you an idea about the dynamics on the ground. So today it's kind of very much innovation driven. And the state of the players right now, it's the margins are getting smaller. So companies have to go for volume in order to stay in business. And sometimes you wonder about these new entrants of companies. How could they convince people to mobilize the funding or allocate funding? Given you have these top 10 companies which are already pretty large, and they are getting bigger year by year. How they aim to compete with them? But very simple, they always find a niche client, or a niche buyer. That they focus or specialize on a special product where they are just a few in this niche, and so they don't have to compete with the big boys, or they simply go into other geographics. It means they do target other markets, not the markets being targeted by the main players. So surprisingly, they do stay in business. So if you talk about industry consolidation, well, me too. I've been preaching about this for at least 10 years, but actually never happened. I mean, there were a peak time where China was home to around about 250 or more module manufacturers, simply because the entry level barrier was so low. I mean, to manufacture solar panels is not high end. I mean, if you then talk about cells, all right, wafer is a different league, and polysilicon anyway. So that's why today you have maybe 15 players in the poly manufacturing segment, but more are coming. Given that the last 2 years we had a constant, let's say, shortage, or let's say a tight supply and demand balance, for polysilicon. So that's why these guys, they had the real cash cow for the last 2 years. And some companies are get attracted by these high returns in no time. That's why now we have a couple of more companies announcing significant investment in the polysilicon segment overall. As well, wafer, so far dominated by just 2 companies, but a few more too are now entering the segment. Yes, with less production capacity, but still in the 30, 40, 50 gigawatt range, which is unheard outside of China. And that's why right now the state of the industry is kind of fairly dynamic, fairly competitive, driven by innovation. Demand outside of China and at home in China is just going through the roof. I mean, most likely this year China will break all previous records in terms of production output, module shipments, local deployment, you name it, or the amount of export volume, measured in US dollars. The first 4 months this year, every month, the total volume or the total value of exported solar PV products amounted to $5 billion. So we talk about a significant industry now. I mean, and it is being certainly no surprise that, for instance, Li Keqiang, the current premier of China, he just went to Germany and France, that a couple of representatives of battery and solar companies joined him on this trip. So it is certainly no coincidence. So this industry right now is undergoing a very interesting, let's say, as well, transformation. A few years ago, companies, let's say 15 years ago, company thought vertically integrated. That was the mantra of the day. Everything under one roof. So I don't have any dependency on anyone. Then there was a time for a couple of years. No. I focus only on 1, maybe 2 segments of the value chain in which I can excel. And the rest I buy from external suppliers. now we are back in this kind of business model again, vertically integrated. Have everything or as much as possible under one single company roof. So that as well is a kind of indication that I have to make sure that I have access to material at any time, the quantity I need. And if I do capture a fairly large part of the value chain, I can hedge the risk of prices going through the roof if I'm dependent on external suppliers. So that's where we are right now, that we are going back to the old model, being vertically integrated as much as possible. So that's very interesting times. And that's, as I mentioned as well, and last but not least, what I mentioned earlier, that you have now a couple of provincial development plans or for the PV industry. There's a strong focus on cell technology. I don't know why. Wafer not that much. But there's always, regardless of what province, at some point further down, fairly detailed on what is supposed to be, let's say, being developed. And solar cell technology is somehow always in the center of the kind of, let's say, provincial industry policy plans. So right now, it's very exciting, as always. I mean, you never get bored in this industry.
No, and it's interesting that they're going to get, they should continue to get continued support from Li Qiang, the current premier, given that, well, he was originally from Zhejiang, if I remember correctly, born in Zhejiang, and then was governor there, and then became deputy mayor or something, or mayor of or Communist Party secretary in Jiangsu, and then was also the mayor or deputy mayor over in Shanghai. So he's got quite a, and we could say that Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Shanghai are pretty much the how shall we call it, the center of the Chinese solar industry, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, if you take Jiangsu as an example, I thought as a province alone, they are responsible for a good 1/3 of the global output of cells and modules, one single province. So I mean, that's what we are talking about. And just to add why it is so dynamic these days, in October last year, they introduced 2 new indexes at the Shanghai Stock Exchange in order to make the industry more attractive for outsiders, to make it known to a broader, let's say, broader people, I mean, for all, representing all walks of life, so that's why apparently these days, financing for, let's say, a new entrant sometimes doesn't appear to be of any concern. And so far, dozens of IPOs. I mean, or financing rounds, ABC, you name it, happens all over the place. I was told there was a company, they did the pitch for the headquartered technology, 800 plus people joined that call. So, so that gives you an idea. I mean, how many people are interested there? And if you talk about the financial sector, because for the last 10 plus years, every year I went down to Hong Kong in order to advise fund managers, asset management, investment companies, etc., in order to read the solar PV market of China. There seems to be a renewed interest in the solar PV industry, because for some time there were just too many players in the industry, and as a company with, let's say, limited resources, manpower or time, etc., you would have over proportionally focus on the PV industry in order to make your investment decision. So sometimes these guys feel like, oh, just if the industry has only 5 or 8 or 10 players maximum, I can keep on focusing here. But if we talk about dozens, for many of these companies, well, it's just too many of them to track them.
Right.
So that has changed. As I mentioned, this is top 10 companies now somehow dominating the industry. So, and overall, I mean, climate change discussions have taken center stage at home. in China and abroad. So here, that too is one, I would say, a significant, let's say, reason why there's a renewed interest among, let's say, the investment community to again look into the solar PV industry for opportunities. Yeah.
Talking about one aspect, which is the overseas markets. So China has been the main engine of solar cell manufacturing for the whole world, basically the factory to the world when it comes to solar cells, solar panels. What about the weight of geopolitics? Now, we don't talk about politics in this podcast because it's because I'm not an expert, so I wouldn't be able to ask any smart questions. But I'm talking about what I mean by weight of geopolitics is, the tariffs and the restriction barriers and some of the kind of plans by North American or European companies to do their own manufacturing.
Well, that is certainly very prominent on many agendas of Chinese colleagues. Yeah, I mean, they do close follow such kind of developments. I mean, dealing with tariffs, etc., or the minimum price undertaking back then in the EU, I mean, that is not something entirely new. It has been around for more than a decade. Yeah, it started, if I'm not mistaken, in 2012, 2013. Yeah, so now a decade later, they are still around and they are not getting less. It's rather they get more. Yeah, so, but that apparently has not prevented China from becoming as big as they are. I mean, today, measured by the modules manufactured and the module installed at home, yeah, and what is being shipped abroad, is roughly kind of that the global markets represent slightly more than around about 55%. Yeah, of the modules produced are being shipped abroad or are being exported, and the remaining 45+% are being installed at home on the ground. So yes, export markets are still very relevant and are still very important. And yes, as of late, we learned about the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. Is offering manufacturers a 10-year horizon on how they can run their numbers, on how by when they think they will be financially viable, etc., pretty much from the early start. If that fully implemented, the US will be the lowest, it will be the location with the lowest cost of production worldwide. I mean, that is truly impressive. Yes, back in Europe, same thinking. They would like to have a larger share of solar panels being produced in Europe. So made in Europe for Europe. And India, we should not forget India. India too has introduced a couple of years ago import duties on cells and modules manufactured in China and outside of China, across Southeast Asia, for instance. They too have ambition in order to meet their own domestic demand with their own local production through the PLI, the Production Linked Incentive Scheme, what they call it. Yeah, and apparently it's paying off. Yeah, so now you have a couple of Vikram Solar, Adani, etc., Waaree, who are Reliance, who are significantly investing now in upstream, and that of course could lead to that we have a more, let's say, I'm not sure, balanced production across the world, because on average, across the entire value chain, China has a global market share of plus 80%. If we zoom in further into, let's say, wafers, China's close to 100% of global production capacity. Cells are not so much far behind. Indeed, it will be a challenge for certain regions and markets to catch up. But it's not the intention to be completely, let's say, self-supplier. I mean, it's just that you meet your own domestic demand in a given region, to some extent. So that's basically the aim. And that, of course, is long-term. It takes time to pull it off. Once you have the policy in place. I mean, the latest development is actually that my own home country, Germany, last week announced that it is seeking applications of companies intending to set up production capacities for solar PV in Germany. because they have apparently identified, myself too, I have to read the details of this announcement first, but it is designed to, that the German government apparently is willing to support such kind of undertakings in Germany in this case. Mm-hmm. So yes, this kind of the political, let's say, environment has not gone away. Let's say even after 1 decade. How much longer that will last is, I guess, is up to everyone's guess. But I doubt they will disappear anytime soon. Well, I mean, one strategy of Chinese companies could be that they take into consideration to set up a fab outside of China. I mean, that you serve markets from within and not from China as a base.
You kind of alluded to kind of the next and kind of final area of discussion, which is the outlook for China's solar industry domestically and also in terms of exports. What are your thoughts about the outlook within the home market?
Oh, very optimistic, very promising. I can't think of any reason why that should go into the reverse. No, it will continue. What we will see that's my take, that among these top 10 companies, they will gain further market share. So they are going ahead of the rest. So we see 10 leading companies or dozens leading companies. It's always very, let's say, challenging to track with technological advancements. If you are for too long bet on the wrong horse, you might be out of business. So that means you have to earmark a significant amount of money as well for R&D. So that's why innovation is key and king. So it helps you to stay in business. Of course, the larger companies they are, the more budget they could earmark for that purpose. But as well, we should not ignore smaller players, startups with a new technology. So here, because what I mentioned earlier, when I was at the SNEC in Shanghai 4 weeks ago, dozens of companies I've never heard before. Why that? Because many of them were founded in 2018, 2019, somehow before COVID. So when then COVID came, they haven't had the chance to seek visibility or to build up their brand. So there's no brand recognition yet. Now they do emerge after COVID and are very hungry and are very aggressive. These are the guys right now who are actually pushing the price limits. So lowering the price, because in order to stay in business, they need to sell. And with that regard, they look for how to further optimize. I'm not talking about compromising quality or cutting corners. Not at all. I mean, because for that business environment is just too competitive. That would be a short-lived strategy if you would cut corner. Because nowadays you have almost, let's say, a full transparency industry. So if something goes wrong with the batch of modules manufactured by a company, ABC, whatever, that will be a known factor among industries, and you're out of business. So here, the next, let's say, 1.5 years or 2.5 years until the end of the current 14th five-year plan, given this China's commitment to achieve a carbon peaking by around 2030, which is another main driver right now, why China is deploying so much solar PV right now. According to my assessment, possibly by this year, or in this year alone, China could install something between 140 and 150 gigawatt, which is a lot. I mean, solar PV is so far measured by existing power generation capacities is number 2 after coal. So it has overtaken wind and hydropower in just 1.5 years. I mean, these two sectors. So one shortage this Chinese PV industry is actually facing, they don't find enough talents. They don't find enough engineers. So the annual demand for, let's say, engineers is something in the order of 100,000 people. They are short by 40,000. So they don't find enough. So there's a lot of, let's say, recruiting, or let's say companies are just putting more money on the table and recruit stuff. That is sometimes okay, sometimes maybe not so, because then what was reported by other companies with whom I spoke in the past, that, well, our chief engineer now is working for them, and mysteriously some of the in-house development now have shown up at the new company where that person is working now. So that means even in-house development sometimes is now being subject to more strict, let's say, regulations or controls, to make sure there won't be any outflow of know-how to my next door competitor. It is right now, given that with this, what I mentioned earlier, with this wave of overcapacity coming along the entire value chain, there's not a single segment which is maybe just even with let's say, demand and supply. Not at all. Silicon wafer cells modules are all in the double. Let's say it's more than double, to how the actual demand is could be in this year, next year, and the year after. So that, of course, will have the potential, and this is already, you see already the first signs of it, that module prices will start to erode on an ever faster pace in the next couple of, let's say, 6 to 9 months. And simply because there's just too much investment currently. Too many are being attracted by these high returns, or are being convinced because the government is seeing the renewable energy sector as the next growth engine, as I mentioned earlier. So they want to answer this call from the government, etc. No, I mean, and demand across the board in the world is just going up. I mean, it's just amazing. And you see, earlier before this podcast, we talked about the heat wave in Spain. Right now, as we speak of. So we have more than one good reason to deploy as much as possible in the shortest period of time possible. I mean, this is no more something we should take too lightly at all.
There are two more questions regarding the outlook, and the first one is some of the Chinese companies, like I think it was Jinko or Canadian Solars and others, have actually invested into solar utility electricity production, utility scale electricity production. I mean, overseas. Including some very large projects in the Middle East. Do you see that continuing?
Definitely. Oh, yeah. They will come. I mean, they have access to their own modules. So they have built up in-house experience, or have a very decent in-house engineering team. They are very established global brands. So the ability to raise funding is given. Not that I'm not saying it's easy. You still have to work for that part. And yes, I mean, it's just another stream of revenues that they can tap into. So besides the manufacturing part, I expect this to continue. Always depends on the local conditions.
Obviously. And how welcoming the government is, the government is. And the second question with regards to the outlook, and the last question is, what are the industry main challenges and main hurdles that is faced right now and over the next few years?
Main challenges, main hurdles. Well, I mean, we touched on the, let's say, global environment or political environment. But if you don't have an alternative supplier on the ground, so for the time to come, you will keep on importing modules made in China. Apparently, you have that kind of transparency protocols being established, so you can track where, under what kind of conditions has it been manufactured. because here you have, let's say, an increased or enhanced level of sensitivity for known reasons. Its main hurdles. Yeah, well, grid capacities. I mean, you can install as much as you want, yeah, but if the local grid capacity is not able to handle it, yeah, what's the point? Yeah, I mean, it's and again, it's China who's on a build out program of its domestic grid infrastructure capacity like no other country worldwide. Mm-hmm. So they do make it happen, yeah. That so whatever is being generated is being fed into the grid and not being curtailed as it was a couple of years ago, yeah. And they got this under control in basically no time, yeah. But now the share of let's say renewables / solar PV in a given market, yeah, is reaching a certain percentage where at some point, yes, it is intermittent, possibly has to be combined with storage capacities, yeah, in order to keep it flowing, the power, or in order to ensure grid stability, that you have to look into how much can the existing grid infrastructure capacity can handle in terms of megawatts and gigawatts of installed solar PV power generation capacities. That's why, let's say, the latest trend in China is now that you have the so-called gigawatt basis. So that means it is combining everything, whatever is given in the local area. That means it is combined with coal, combined with hydropower, with a wind farm, solar PV, whether it's on land or onshore, on the lakes, doesn't matter. China now, or Jiangsu province, for instance, just approved a pipeline of more than 12 gigawatts for so-called offshore floating PV, because China too, in some areas, is seeing some challenges, yeah, because what is more important, to feed my people? So that means to ensure food security, or do I generate green power? Yeah, because even there, in particular, all along the eastern coastline of China, densely populated, and where the bulk of China's food is being grown and harvested, yeah, there too, over the last, let's say, 12, 18 months, you have seen an increased number of regulations looking into to which extent you can use land usually used for agricultural purposes, yeah, no more, yeah, unless you make an agriculture PV system out of it, yeah, where you can still harvest the crops and harvest the sun at the same time. So grid capacity could be one of the constraints, yeah, in a couple of markets around the world, simply because solar PV is modular, quick installation periods. It can be very small, can be very big. And that maybe could be a challenge for the local grid infrastructure. So that could be something where then projects will be delayed. Yeah? But at the same time, production capacities are being built up in no time, designed to meet this ever-increasing demand, but then facing these kind of obstacles where the local grid can no longer tolerate additional capacities. And again, in the context of China, so far, until 3 years ago, it was very much dominated by ground-mounted utility-scale systems. Now it's pretty much 50-50. It's distributed PV, and that is being split into residential PV or commercial industrial rooftop systems, because they need to take away the pressure from the grid infrastructure, and they would like to have the point of generation close to the point of consumption on the roof, and below the factory is consuming my green power. So these are the kind of constraints, or from a more technical point of view, depends on where you are and in which market there. The regular, let's say, standard module types, which can be very heavy, not to mention they have become very large as of late. They are too heavy for the regular rooftops of factories, which were not designed to cope with the additional weight of a solar panel in the first place. So that means you can no longer tap this market. But for that purpose, if, let's say, the roof structure is too weak for a regular conventional module, you come up with the lightweight module. So that means they weigh maybe 4 to 6 kilograms per square meter. Yeah? So that's where you can tap another market segment, etc., etc. So here are the constraints, but it's the most significant constraint or obstacle or challenge could be, if we put, let's say, the global political environment aside for a moment, local grid capacities. Yeah.
Right. So the main kind of the main massive challenges are the geopolitics and the grid capacity, which is actually the grid capacity, not just for China, but for the rest of the world. This has been a fantastic conversation with an old friend, and I know throughout the years we've had so many of these conversations, but this time it's actually recorded in a podcast, so that's great. I was wondering, Frank, do you have any kind of final takeaways or final thoughts?
Oh, definitely. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, even now after 20 years, being in the industry, I never get bored. Sometimes a bit less dynamic, honestly speaking, here would be nice, because sometimes you wish, all right, come on. I mean, I don't have to have this 24/7 mode, or at least 6 days a week, not really, because I remember way too often, like on a Friday noontime or afternoon time, you were looking forward to your, let's say, well-deserved weekend, and then, well, you still happen to check on, for instance, on the National Energy Administration website, and there it is, another announcement, and something which definitely has some kind of impact, So basically, it spoiled your entire Friday evening, because now you have to work on a translation. What does it mean? And send it out to your clients, almost like a media journalist, So no. I mean, it's kind of. Solar PV has never been as affordable as it is nowadays. That is amazing. The scope of applications is just growing by the day, or let's say every half year you have new types of applications coming out. It's getting more and more sophisticated. We are at the stage where every kilowatt hour counts. Subsidies or support schemes are pretty much almost some kind of history. So the industry has to stand on its own feet. We do see a couple of dozens of new companies emerging, with guys who have a very decent track record, on their backs, So putting their brain and their time into it in order to make this happen and push it to the next level. And not only China, very much across the world. It is good for the climate, as we both know. It's green, clean, climate friendly. You can check so many boxes. It does generate jobs on the ground. It is being modular, small scale to very, very large scale if needed or possible. We see an ever-changing industry landscape. Some companies, old companies, even after two decades, are still in the front line, but are being challenged by the newcomers, so to say. Or it's a new type of application or a new technological concept. So that is making sure that we all have to remain alert in what is happening on the ground or within the industry. Don't ignore solar PV.
It's great to end on a positive note. So I once again, Frank, I want to really, really thank you for your time. I appreciate you in between trips. And also, as you mentioned, the solar industry is so dynamic that keeps you busy 24/7. So really appreciate your time, and it was really great to have you on the Asia Climate Finance podcast.
Likewise, Joseph, it has been a pleasure and talking to you and discussing and reflecting on how the solar PV industry, at least from my perspective, has evolved over the last 20 years, and counting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Thank you for listening. Please contact us for any thoughts on topics or comments. Contact details are in the show notes. The Asia Climate Finance podcast is presented for educational purposes only. All information in the podcast must not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed by our guests are personal and may not represent those of current or previous employers.